So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the 8 areas that I would say impact our mental health and well-being, and what can go wrong in those different areas. And then in the next video, I will talk about how those areas are constantly influencing one another, what treatment interventions and lifestyle changes can be helpful. And then in the third video, I will give a case example using myself, as I've had many of these different areas impacted, as have many people that I work with. So let's go ahead and get started. So these are the 8 areas that I'm going to be talking about. Genetics and epigenetics. We all come into the world with genes that will shape part of who we are. And of those genes, we have many mutations. Some mutations can be expressed, but many are expressed dependent on methyl markers, which have the ability to potentially turn on and off genes. So these other areas that I'm going to talk about very much impact this epigenetic expression. So again, we can come into the world with a lot of vulnerabilities, but we may never have any problems with those whatsoever. And for many of them, if we do, we have all these other areas that we can impact to potentially turn off many of those genes. We do have protective genes, and then we have some disease-causing genes. And so it's the balance of those methylation and how those genes are being expressed that can keep us in a healthy state. And there is fluidity in our lifetime of how these genes are expressed. So we may have problems at one time in our life because of certain factors, and then in another part, we won't. We all have a microbiome, a balance of microbes within our gut primarily, but also in other parts of our body and on our skin. We all have an immune system that is constantly interacting with our central nervous system and with our endocrine or hormone system. We all live in an environment and have exposures to people, to air, to food, to water, to things we put on our skin. We all have had an early attachment experience that stays within us and shapes much of who we are, and that would be the first 3 years of our life. We all have an autonomic nervous system. That's our nervous system that largely is operating within our body, not necessarily in our brain. So it's automatic, and it's basically our fight or flight or rest and digest system. We all have a structure in terms of how we're made, and this structure can be damaged through physical trauma. And I'll explain a number of different ways that we can differ in terms of how we're built and how that can impact our brain health. And we all have an inner life, how we think about ourselves and the world and others, and how we think about our past and our future. And again, all these areas are going to be impacting one another. So as a holistic psychiatrist, when I'm meeting with someone, I'm thinking about all these and listening for different symptoms, but also different things in someone's timeline that could suggest something gone awry in one of these areas. And for most people, it's an alignment of factors that are stacking up, and then a threshold is reached, and then they become symptomatic. So this gives us an opportunity to go after a lot of different areas, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything needs to be addressed with some type of perfection for someone to move to healing. So some of the ways that our genetics can impact our vulnerabilities in terms of mental health are that it can cause us to have particular nutrient imbalances. Now, the work of Dr. William Walsh, and he has an excellent website at the Walsh Research Institute, he identified the most common nutrient imbalances in those with brain-related symptoms, or basically psychiatric symptoms, and found that low zinc, high copper, and methylation imbalances were particularly common. And that by addressing those, people's symptoms, most people could have significant improvement. So methylation is part of what I was mentioning earlier about these this ability to methylate is part of what impacts epigenetics. Methylation also impacts our ability to detoxify, and it impacts our ability to break down histamine, and because it impacts genetic expression, it impacts the expression of receptors for particular neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. And it's this expression that impacts things like depression, ADHD, anxiety, and a number of other psychiatric conditions. So I will definitely be doing future videos about methylation. Other areas, as I mentioned, we can differ in our ability to detoxify, and if we are vulnerable to toxicity, that means we would be more prone to what is called oxidative stress, and that's basically where there will be cellular and tissue damage as a result of toxicity, inflammation, and such. Our genes and genetic expression can impact our vulnerability to things like inflammation, so an exaggerated immune response, or even autoimmunity, where our immune system is going after particular parts of our body. It can impact our stress response. Some of us are absolutely more inclined to experience stress than others, and it can impact how durable we are, our connective tissue. And it's that connective tissue that is a barrier between ourselves and the outside world, our gastrointestinal tract, and even the barrier between our bloodstream and our brain. So I'll discuss that more in a bit. So again, the microbiome is the balance of microbes, and I'm going to be focusing more on the gastrointestinal tract because that is where we have trillions of microbes living within us and helping sustain our health. They help us absorb nutrients. They help the barrier between our gastrointestinal tract and the bloodstream. And they're what keep our immune system in check. So if we are having, well, I should say first, what we want is to have a diverse microbiome. And the bullets are not the diversity. The bullets are problematic areas. But what we want is diversity. We want a lot of beneficial bacteria that are, again, interacting with the immune system, helping us with absorbing nutrients, and even they make some nutrients. But when things go awry, we can have what is called dysbiosis, and that's where there's an imbalance. That's where we may have more problematic bacteria than should be there. We could have candida or yeast overgrowth. Now, candida exists in our gastrointestinal tract normally, but if we've been on a lot of antibiotics, or for some people it doesn't take much antibiotics for that, for those beneficial microbes to diminish somewhat, and for something like candida to proliferate. Candida makes a particular toxin. The same goes for problematic bacteria and parasites and even viruses. And any of these can be sources of inflammation, and sources of inflammation in the gastrointestinal tract can create psychiatric symptoms in many ways. One way is through the vagus nerve. The other is through the immune system and how it communicates with immune cells in the brain. So many people don't realize, for example, if after having been on a course of antibiotics or even a couple of courses in a row, that they could start to have depression or brain-related symptoms, and they may not associate it with the antibiotics. Children are getting a lot of antibiotics, and Fortunately, doctors are becoming more conservative about that, but nonetheless, there are many children who are now adults who have what we would consider dysbiosis, or an imbalance in their microbiome that's causing brain-related symptoms or psychiatric conditions. So we have many parts to our immune system. So I'm just going to be highlighting a few that come up more commonly when it comes to brain health. And these include mast cells. Mast cells are throughout our body. They're especially prevalent in our skin, sinuses, gastrointestinal tract, and bladder. Those areas basically that interface with the outside world, so to speak. And they are on high alert for danger and can, when activated, release what are called cytokines, inflammatory mediators, and histamine. Now, we're all familiar with histamine from like respiratory allergies, but histamine can have impacts even on brain health, including causing fatigue or brain fog. So when someone is having mast cell activation, or especially prone to those mast cells destabilizing, there's usually an underlying factor, either one of those microbes that I mentioned earlier, and or a form of toxicity. We most typically see it, or I do in my practice, with mold toxicity or biotoxins. So mold toxicity is a biotoxin. Other biotoxins are things like the toxins made from Bartonella, Lyme, as two other examples. But I find mold toxicity to be particularly common. There does seem to be a genetic vulnerability to mast cell activation, but something like mold toxicity will take it to another level. Microglia cells are immune cells in the brain. They're not nerve cells. They are supportive cells and immune cells. And when they are activated, they can cause brain inflammation. So mast cells do communicate with microglial cells. So people can have both systemic inflammation and with that brain inflammation. Another interesting thing about microglial cells is once they have switched forms, and this would be, for example, if someone has had head trauma and they have an initial brain inflammation, they can maintain in that high alert form. Thus, the next sort of insult doesn't have to be so severe for the person to go back into brain inflammation. And so there are strategies we have for lowering brain inflammation and for helping those glial cells revert back to their, to being close to at least their original form. Autoantibodies are basically antibodies that will act on a particular part, in this case of the brain, creating psychiatric symptoms. So PANS and PANDAS, these are a phenomenon that we see in children. PANDAS is something that will happen after a strep infection, and the body is making antibodies to a part of the brain that is then causing the person to have obsessive compulsive type symptoms, changes often in their handwriting and behavior. There's also what we call autoimmune encephalitis or autoimmune psychosis, which is, again, something that can be a psychiatric manifestation that is secondary to antibodies to particular microbes in the body. Okay, environment encompasses a lot, from what we put in our body, what we breathe into our body, what we put on our body in terms of body products. It encompasses the people around us and even the electromagnetic fields that we don't see, which are even more so now with Wi-Fi and cell phones and even 5G. So ideally, we have a minimal amount of toxins in our water, in the air that we breathe, in the food that we eat. But the reality is that we're all living increasingly in a more toxic environment. And so much of what I do in my work is lower what I would call oxidative stress, that toxic burden on the body, and helping people know how to do that. And in doing so, that lowers inflammation, thus lowers brain inflammation, and so forth. Later, I'll talk more about how all these different areas relate. But problems that I see very commonly are mold toxicity. I specifically look for those because they do create for people depression, anxiety, fatigue, inattention. I've seen a number of people with mania who had underlying mold toxicity. It can even contribute to some psychotic symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. I would say Bartonella and Lyme also have have biotoxins. And so while these are biotoxins, we also have toxins that can be coming from an imbalance in those microbes in the gut, and we would call those endotoxins. We also can have metal toxicity from even the air that we're breathing. We can have it from amalgam fillings in our mouth. We all are dealing with a degree of chemical exposure and chemical toxicity. And again, the idea isn't to get to a place of perfection where we don't have any toxins whatsoever. It's to minimize the load enough such that our body's not overburdened, and then dealing with oxidative stress, that burden that then is creating tissue damage, inflammation, and so forth. And electromagnetic fields are a much bigger issue than many of us had realized. And with 5G coming, I would only expect there to be more psychiatric manifestations. Trauma is something that people are more familiar with in terms of how what we experience in our outside world, how it can shape our well-being and brain health moving forward. Similarly, our relationships, if we have relationships that are unhealthy, that can lead to a chronic physiologic state of stress, and from stress comes inflammation, and from inflammation comes brain inflammation and symptoms. I'll be explaining that further. So we all have an experience in our first 3 years of life that will significantly impact our physiology and our mental health going forward. Now, because neuroplasticity, we do have the potential to change some of that and have different experiences. But essentially, given our early experience with caregivers, we develop either a secure attachment or an insecure attachment. Secure attachment would be an attachment style in which we are able to experience both autonomy and intimacy. So we're comfortable being alone, and we're comfortable being very close to someone that we trust. An insecure attachment can look different. There's 3 particular types that have been studied. One is called avoidant or dismissive, and that's more on the extreme end of autonomy. And these children and individuals have more difficulty seeking out or desiring even connection and intimacy. An ambivalent, preoccupied type of insecure attachment would be one in which it's a highly anxious experience for the person to be in a relationship. So there will be a lot of tension, a lot of sort of push and pull, wanting connection, pushing away connection, and it can be somewhat chaotic experience. Both the avoidant and the ambivalent do show some evidence of genetic vulnerabilities. So again, all these areas interplay. Disorganized attachment style is also in the insecure realm, and in this case, someone has experienced seemingly trauma to the point that they basically check out in terms of their relationship style. And this can look like dissociating. So our autonomic nervous system is quite fascinating. And again, this is the part of our nervous system that we're not thinking about. And it is basically broken down into two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. But more importantly, just know that the two parts are primarily that which helps us go into fight or flight when we're in danger, and that which allows us to be in a rest and digest state. And when we're in the rest and digest, we're able to engage with others, feel a sense of calm and peace. And when we're in a state of fight or flight, we will have a lot of physiologic changes, and it's not a time to engage with others. And it's also a time that sets us into an inflammatory state. So it's very adaptable, but if we're in a state of chronic stress or a chronic fight or flight, then that can certainly take its toll on the body in terms of stress hormones and inflammation. The freeze response is also adaptive, and that's when we're dealing with such overwhelming stress that we can't fight or flee. And so our body will essentially have us check out. And that could be in the form of passing out. It could be dissociating. This is something that when we see it in a clinical perspective, it's when it's happening, obviously not in the state of overwhelming threat, but it's just randomly happening. Now, people can go into fight or flight or freeze or shut down as a defensive mechanism when they're triggered, and sometimes triggers are not necessarily unknown to people. They could have something in their early past, especially during that attachment period, where their body will basically sense something, be it a smell or a sound, that their physiology has associated with threat, and then they could go into fight or flight, which could look like high anxiety or agitation, or they could go into a freeze or shutdown. Now, know too that our autonomic nervous system isn't just affecting sort of that subjective response that I'm just described. It's also impacting our heart rate, our digestion, our respiratory system. So when we're experiencing, for example, this calm rest and digest state, that is when our digestive organs are working well, our liver and gallbladder are working well and helping us with detoxification, our kidneys are working well. So there's a lot that we benefit from when we're in this rest and digest state. And when we're not in the rest and digest and we're in the chronic fight or flight, then a lot of those organ systems won't be working optimally. So this area of structure is, again, something that people are often not considering at all. So again, we come into the world with our physical being, and some of that, how that's shaped, is obviously genetic, but some of it is impacted with what happens to us in our environment. For example, head trauma could impact our structure and result in poor compliance of the cranium, the skull. And that poor compliance of the skull can then impact things downstream. So it can impact the functioning, for example, of our vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is a nerve that comes out of the brainstem and feeds into all the organs, and it really is what is primarily operating when I mentioned earlier about this rest and digest state. So if we don't have good cranial compliance and our vagus is not being accessed optimally, then we could be physiologically in a state of threat, not because there's something threatening in our environment, but because of a structural issue with our cranium and or our neck. So people that are hypermobile, meaning they're particularly flexible, they don't have to have what's called Ehlers-Danlos, but people can be particularly flexible and have instability of the upper part of their neck, and that can potentially affect the vagus nerve by way of the atlas, which is it's the top vertebra, and relative to the others, it's relatively free floating. So, and it doesn't take much for that to get misaligned, even slightly, and it can create subtle symptoms throughout the body, but also in the head and neck area. We have other cranial nerves besides the vagus that impact our eyes, our ability to swallow, our hearing, even our inner ear and balance. So again, our structure as far as our head and neck are very important when it comes to brain health. Even our posture and how we carry ourselves will impact not only the vagus, and it will impact how much we're getting oxygen in, and thus getting oxygen to our brain. Our blood pressure, if it's low, similarly we will have a decreased perfusion of blood to the brain, and that can cause symptoms for people. But our connective tissue, while it affects joint hypermobility, as I mentioned, it also affects everything from our organs, our vascular system. And part of our vascular system is our gut-blood barrier. So there's a barrier between our gastrointestinal tract and the blood through which nutrients are absorbed. And if we have a lot of permeability there, which could be because of a weak connective tissue, but also because of dysbiosis or an imbalance of microbes or inflammation, then food particles, toxins, even particular microbes could be passing that barrier, getting into the bloodstream. And then we also have a blood-brain barrier where similarly those things could be getting into the brain through that blood-brain barrier. And when you hear about the gut-blood barrier and the blood-brain barrier, usually they have similar vulnerabilities. For example, gluten has been shown to increase permeability at the gut-blood barrier, but it has also been shown for some people to increase permeability at the blood-brain barrier. And then lastly, but certainly not to minimize it, is our inner life, and that is all of our thoughts that are going on day in, day out. And those are thoughts about ourselves, about others, about our past, future, about the world, about the whole of our lives. And ideally, we are sort of taking advantage of that, using that, taking time for solitude and silence so as to be able to hear this inner voice that we all have that moves us forward, that knows our abilities, our passions, our purpose. We're given so much input from our environment and the outside world that often our ego is crowding out what I would call the soul. And however much we can be tapping into that inner voice and listening to that, that will lower our physiologic stress response, because we are built to do so. And if we are only focused on outside expectations, then we will be in a chronic state of physiologic stress and really going against our nature, which is stressful on the body and thus stressful on the brain. Ideally, too, we, in our early attachment experiences have developed a sense of trust, or if not then, later in life through what we would call corrective emotional experiences with other people. And we basically learn to trust. And we also know how to listen to our body such that we know when we're not trusting someone. And that's very protective and useful. But if we don't trust anybody, then that would be an area of concern. Our inner life is how we think about our past. Are we able to make meaning of difficulties or tragedies in our life? Or is the story that we tell ourselves that of being a victim, and having that story basically hold us back in our healing or moving forward or thriving? We also have different ways to think about our future. We could be having aspirations, sort of visions for what we want for ourselves in our life. And in doing so, that changes our physiology. If we can sort of imagine what it would be like, that accesses the autonomic nervous system. It calms us down. But if when we consider the future, are thinking about fear and what if this doesn't happen, and if we need certainty and we cling to certainty and things needing to be a certain way, that will be stressful, inflammation producing, put us in a chronic state of fight or flight, have problems accessing the rest and digest and the vagus nerve. And again, we can train our brains to learn to embrace even uncertainty. How we experience the world could be threatening. Everybody can be threatening. The world at large could be a place of threat. And obviously our inner life is very much impacted by our experience with media. Are we getting a constant input of tragedy, crisis, threat through what we're seeing in the news? And obviously the news has advertisers to pay, and so they know those stories will get more attention, more viewers, and more money. But for us, it puts us in a state of fight or flight, fear, inflammation, and the physiologic stress response, stress hormones, and more. So we can also impact what's coming in, what we're seeing in terms of the good in the world. And part of that we can shape through what types of social media we look at, what types of news we look at. And then our life is at large. Do we feel that we have a sense of purpose? Even if in the present we are focused on healing or focused on self-care, we do know that if people have a sense of purpose or can find their sense of purpose, or just know that they have a purpose and they maybe haven't found it yet, that contributes to mental health. I hope this was useful, and I hope it gives you a different lens through which to look at psychiatric symptoms. I look forward in the next video to talking about how these areas impact one another and are constantly impacting one another, and treatment approaches and lifestyle changes that can be particularly impactful. And then if you have questions, please feel free to ask below or on my website at CourtneySnyderMD.com, where I take a deeper dive into many of these topics that I've mentioned here. And I will be doing future videos on many of these topics. Until we can hopefully connect in a future video, take care. Bye-bye.